Okay, so in this section we're going to talk about conversion and authoring in Hoops Communicator. So this is how you're going to get your data into the system so that we can stream it down to the client. So there's two ways you can go about doing this. The first and most popular way is using Hoops Converter. Hoops Converter is a native application that we ship along with the package that handles most of this process for you using Hoops Exchange. The other way that you can get your data into the system is by directly using our data authoring API. So you're going to want to use this method if you have proprietary file formats or file formats that aren't supported by Hoops Exchange or HPS. So Hoops Converter has a number of features that we built into it that most customers would want to have out of the box. So for example, Hoops Converter can generate PNG files for CAD files. You can also export like an XML assembly tree so that you can link your data from source CAD file to the data in Hoops Communicator. And it can also create master files for shattered mode, which we're going to talk more about shattered in the future. The data authoring API can accomplish some of this, but by using this method, you're going to have to implement a lot of those features on your own. So it's a trade-off between the convenience of Hoops Converter or the flexibility of the data authoring API. In general, if you're working with file formats that are supported by Exchange, we strongly encourage you to use Converter. But if you're not, then you're going to have to use data authoring API. And the nice thing about this is that both of these methods produce the same output. So once you create an SC file, there's no difference between streaming something that was created with the Hoops Converter application or using the data authoring API. So one feature of Hoops Converter that is useful is these XML batch processing. So what this lets you do is kind of specify your conversion job in an XML file. And by specifying the XML file, you can do things that you can't normally do on the command line as easily. So for example, if you're using the command line of Hoops Converter, you can only create one PNG image at a time. You can just specify that command line option once. Same with like the resolution or background color of PNGs. With this XML batch processing, you can create multiple PNGs at once and specify all the parameters for each one of those conversions separately. And all of the options for Hoops Converter are supported in the XML batch processing. And each command line option is just specified as an attribute for an output element. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch over to the documentation for Hoops Converter and the command line options. I just want to call out a few of these options that people are going to be using fairly frequently, and we'll just kind of talk through some of them. So for example, the big ones are obviously input, which is how you're going to specify So input is going to be how you specify the file that you want to convert. The other ones that you're going to want to look at are the different output types. So we support a number of file formats that you can write out to. So the most common one you're going to output to is SC, but you can also output to HSF, PDF, PRC, or a number of other file formats. Another one to take a look at here is output SCS. We'll talk a little bit more about SCS when we dive into how the actual stream cache is working. But you just want to keep in mind that we can also output that format, and this is useful for smaller files because it doesn't require a server backend component. And we'll talk more about when we want to use that, but SCS is something that people often forget that we have, that can actually be useful for customers that don't have very large models and don't want to have server backend infrastructure set up to support the streaming. Another one here that is going to come up a lot that we want to call out is this output XML assembly tree. So the output XML assembly tree is an XML file that's created that describes the structure of the model that we've created. So you can use that to have sort of view, not a graphical view, but a view of how the model is going to look once it's loaded. So for example, you could use this file to walk the assembly tree without loading the model. So if you wanted to get some intelligence about a particular file, you can look at this assembly tree file and see what your model looks like. Another thing to note is this assembly tree is going to contain all of the IDs for each part in the model. So like we talked a little bit about in previous sections where we had the example of the manufacturer that had different quantities, the way they would link that up ahead of time would be to look at this assembly tree file, and each particular node has a unique ID in the file. And they can use that to create the link between the graphical object on the screen and the item in the database. And this doesn't require them to load that model. They just have to parse this XML file. So that's something to remember, that when customers are asking about how to link up data, this is a good one to look at. We have a number of PNG output settings, everything from resolution to the camera. We can also set the canonical view of the PNG. Remember we did that in a previous exercise for the JavaScript, but we can also do that in Converter so that people can generate multiple views of the model for preview images. So these two command line options, prepare shattered parts and prepare shattered XML, we're going to talk more about that in a later section. However, these guys are important for shattered mode, and creating a shattered model is a two-step process. First, you have to convert all of the parts into the SC files, and then you have to prepare an XML file that describes how these parts fit together. We'll talk about that more in the future, but we'll do an example of this a bit later. But these two are important for the shattered mode, so you're going to want to be familiar with those. When we move down in these command line options, we're going to get to the SC export group of options. And these options, I'm not going to go through each one individually, but they let you tune what data we export out of the file. So we're going to read in all of the PRC data, but we don't necessarily have to export all of it. So you might want to disable some of these export options if you're trying to keep your file size down. Or if you want to, maybe you just know you don't need these particular options, you can remove them. But these guys will let you tune what comes out of the file, or what goes into the final file. And one final thing to note is the SC working directory. So in some cases, we need to have like a scratch folder, so this lets you specify where we would write any temporary files, and then those are cleaned up. But we need to have write access to some operations, so it's recommended you set this to some temporary directory that you can write to. And then naturally we have the error codes, so 0 is success, 1 is failure. And you're going to want to look into the logs for additional details if you get a 1 back. So one final thing to talk about in regards to Hoops Converter is this library that we ship with a package called libconverter. So libconverter is a C++ library that essentially is the heart of Hoops Converter. And We make this available to customers to embed in their own application if you need to do that for whatever reason. And it can do everything the Hoops Converter can. And the idea of libconverter is to kind of have like a file save as type of operation for your own product. So you can imagine loading in a file and people are viewing it in your own application, and then you want to sort of save this for the web. And using libconverter, we can take that data and then create an SC file from another application. So we have a couple customers that kind of make use of that, but this is just something to keep in mind that's also available if, for whatever reason, you don't want to launch an external process. You can use libconverter to create stream cache files from within your own application.